So today we'll be talking with Remy Dou. Remy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your research here at FIU?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to have a conversation. Um, my name is Remy Dou, and I always mention this, but I ask people not to call me Dr. Dou, at least my students. So I
Sure.
just say, call me Remy.
Okay.
Um, and I work at FIU, and I have two appointments: a dual appointment with the Department of Teaching and Learning, and with the STEM Transformation Institute. And a lot of my colleagues work in the field of STEM education, so learning of science, technology, engineering, and math. And many of them focus on STEM learning that happens either in school settings like middle school, high school, or elementary, or at the university level. I actually don't study how people learn STEM in school or formal settings. I study how people learn STEM outside of school, what we sometimes refer to as informal. So whether you're learning about, primates at the zoo, or you're learning about gear ratios at the science center, or you're watching Animal Planet, on your couch, all that kind of math and science learning that happens outside of school. That's where I spend most of my time studying and researching and hopefully trying to understand better.
So Remy, how has the pandemic affected your research and your work?
Well, my research focuses on learning science outside of school. And the one thing that I keep thinking about, and what I've been thinking about for 2 or 3 weeks now, is what are people learning about COVID-19? Where are they learning it from? Who are they learning it from? And how has what they've been learning affected their behavior or changed the way they do things, if at all? And so that's been kind of on my mind a lot. And even though, sometimes my research focuses on learning that happens in places like zoos and science centers and places that are more, institutional, even they're still out of school, it's still what we call informal learning. But this kind of learning that happens like in everyday life, that's the kind of learning that I'm really curious about. Like, what kind of everyday science are people learning? How are they learning it? And what kind of impact does that have on their lives? And so I've been thinking a lot about that, especially around this, this virus and this disease that's spreading.
And your research, is it informed at all by the ways that you learned about science as a child?
So much. And I'll give you an example. And maybe you might also relate because you're a science communicator, and so you recognize that there are different audiences and that not the same message won't reach the same audience. And so in my own life, I grew up very poor. My parents had come here from Cuba, and we had nothing, like a lot of families in Miami. We just start from zero. And growing up, at one point, I ended up just living with my two younger brothers, and my mom. So it was just the four of us. My mom worked 2 jobs. She barely spoke English. She understood a little bit. And I had to take care of my 2 younger brothers. And I think of, what would have happened to us back then, the kinds of decisions that my mom would have made for us, how she would have processed the information that she would be getting from all these different, sources. And I compare that to how I now process the information that we get from the news or from the internet or whatever. And so now I have children of my own, and I'm processing this information, and I'm translating it in my mind, communicating it to my children, communicating it to my family in a way that is probably different than the way my mom would have done the same when we were younger, because she had different background, different experiences, and different resources. And so that's made me think a lot about how do we teach people, science when they come from very different backgrounds and experiences, and they care about things differently, right? And so I might care about, the NIH, producing a preprint research study on the virus. I am sure my mom would not be reading, a medical research article.
Right.
And so in thinking about how do we communicate this very important information that could save people's lives, to the general public in different sectors of the public. Since I spent a lot of time about learning and education, we also have something similar we call the deficit model of learning, where we don't, the idea is don't assume that your learners don't bring anything to the table, right? Like, we all bring something to the table, and when we build on that, then we can have some real learning.
I know you have an NSF career grant. It's called Talking Science. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Talking Science.
And tell us a little bit more about that project.
I love this project. I grew up, my dad was like a frustrated physicist. He went to school in Cuba. He studied physics in Cuba. He like just barely had gotten his bachelor's degree. He was like one semester away from finishing his studies. And then he and my mom left the country and took me with them, and he never finished. But he loved talking about science. And I grew up just randomly every day talking about the stars, about waterfalls, about something we saw on TV, something that came up on the news. And that really had a big impact on me for a couple of reasons. One, it made me feel like science was cool, and I wanted to learn because I was like, oh, it is cool. Like, you're right, that is super interesting. But then also it was tied to my bonding time with my dad. And when you have that kind of like emotional connection with a human being, that stays with you for a long time. And so I've done some research with Zara, Dr. Zara Hazari, whom she's also in the School of Ed, and she also works in identity research. And part of her research shows that this kind of everyday random science talk has a lot to do with people later on in their lives seeing themselves as scientists and choosing to want to learn more about science, or pursuing hobbies that are science related, or even choosing careers that are science related. And so, but there's very little known about talking science, which is what my research is about. Well, if people are talking science, who's talking science? Is it children? How old? And are they going to one parent, both parents? And when do these conversations happen? Do they happen in the car, or do they happen, while watching TV? And parts of these conversations really have an impact on children's lives that lasts to the point that, that when they're in college, they're thinking, well, I want to be, an engineer or a doctor or something like that. So that's what it's all about in general. Just this everyday science talk, which is very pertinent nowadays because there's all this scientific information that we're hearing, and kids are asking their parents, or parents are talking to their children about the virus and about the pandemic, and that's generating some conversations about science.
Right, that's what I was going to ask. So how does this tie in with now? There's a lot of with the situation going on now, there's obviously a lot of science talk going on. How do you think that that's impacting kids' identities with STEM?
Parents have a major role to play in who their children become and how they see themselves. I will say that it's not the only role. And having 3 kids myself, I know that my 3 kids, each of them are very different from one another. These weird personalities that I'm always like, where did you get that from? Because I didn't teach you that. But obviously the relationship with me is going to leave an imprint and an impression on who they grow up to be. And so what we've seen and what the data is showing us is that the parent doesn't have to know everything about everything. The parent doesn't even have to be a scientist or even like science. But children, because we are born naturally, they're going to ask questions. And you're going to be watching TV together, or listening to the radio together, or a neighbor's going to come by and say something, and the child's going to ask a question. And it's at that moment how the parent reacts to their child's interest and to their child's question that's going to make the biggest difference. Are you going to react in a way that's, superficial and be like, oh yeah, cool, but then kind of ignore it? Or are you going to try to engage your child?
So it's less about how much science the parent actually knows and more about how they interact with their kids when they're talking about science.
Yeah. We've interviewed a bunch of college students who are now all STEM majors, either math majors, or they're going to be doctors, or they're going to be chemists. And in almost every single case, their parents reacted in a way that expressed interest in what the child was, bringing up whenever they brought something up that was kind of random. And there were many cases where the parent would say, well, I don't know the answer to that question, but let's go figure it out. And then the parent would actively in that moment do something about it. Let's go online, let's go to the library. Oh, I have a friend who actually knows, let's call this person. And that is communicating so many things to the child. That's communicating that what the child is thinking about is interesting. So the child feels like, oh, I guess this is interesting. The child is communicating to the child that they are capable of understanding and that their parent feels like they're capable of understanding. It's communicating to the child that this is a fun thing to do, right? And there's all these emotions tied in development, right? Now you're bonding with so it becomes more than just a science. It's about bonding with your parent. This beautiful, complex learning experience that's going to be very hard to forget. Right. But these college students that we're interviewing are thinking back to when they're like 5 or 6 years old, and you could see in their eyes, to them, it's like it just happened.
In college and high school, students feel that biology and chemistry are these very scary subjects that they're just not capable of learning. And when you were talking, something that really caught my attention was that interaction makes the kids feel that they are capable of understanding that. And that must be a huge part of it, because you hear that all the time with physics, with biology, chemistry. A lot of students don't even try because they feel that it's so intimidating.
That's actually a really big part of our research and what we think about. It's sad, but it's true that science and math that most kids experience in school is a science and math that excludes different groups, different cultures, and specifically cultures that have been minoritized in science and math. And so, like I ask my students all the time, name a famous scientist, name a famous mathematician. And they'll name a bunch of, European white men with crazy hair, forever and ever. So Einstein is always like the stereotype, and Isaac Newton and all these stereotypes. And then I'll say, well, can you name anybody that's not a man and that's not white or, European centric? Yeah. And they're like, oh, Marie Curie, right? That's the first one. And it's like, okay, what about somebody that's not European centric? What about like a Hispanic scientist or, a Nigerian scientist, right? Or I don't know, an Indian scientist. And many of them can't, right? Or if they can, they have to like really, really think about it, right? Like it's not that person at the top of their mind. And so the formal school might not be explicitly telling kids, hey, you don't belong in science and math, but there's this like unconscious messaging, like, hey, the people that do science and math are not people that look like you, are not people that come from the same cultures as you. Whether or not, there are a lot of amazing teachers that are trying to inspire their kids, but that's not always what's coming across in that subtle messaging. And sometimes it's really not that subtle, where you'll be in math class or physics class, and a teacher might make a joke about girls not being good at math, right? Yeah. And to the teacher, it's just a funny joke, but that leaves an impression on the young women in that class. And so if those are the kinds of messaging that you're getting in school, then parents serve almost as a buffer, right? Because your parent is most likely going to be able to understand your culture, accept your gender, accept your social class, accept your ethnic identity, and understand all those aspects of you better than anybody. So when you're talking about science with your parent, you feel like all of who I am is accepted, not just my interest in science, but that I'm a girl or a boy or non-binary, or that I am, Hispanic or half Colombian, half, Puerto Rican, or whatever, the complexity of our identities, all of it is accepted in that family bond and in that family conversation.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a researcher after being a teacher for so many years?
Teachers work so hard. I will tell you, God bless teachers. They're work, and especially now during this whole, distance learning, they are working so hard. And so just a kudos to all K-12 teachers out there. But I do remember, so I had the opportunity to be kind of like a consultant. I got a fellowship at the National Science Foundation. And essentially what they wanted was to really hear teachers' perspectives, specifically science and math teachers. And so they would invite teachers to spend a year working there. I worked in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of DC. And during that year, they would ask for my opinion on a variety of things and give them the perspective of a classroom teacher. Many of them were actually, almost all of them were, academics who may have taught, years and years prior, but they didn't know what it was like to be in the classroom at that time. And so they said, well, these are the kinds of programs we're thinking of developing. What do you think? What are your thoughts, given that you've been in the classroom recently? And then they got to know my work, and then I got to know their work, and while they may not have been in the classroom, they were expanding what we know about how people learn. And that fascinated me, right? Like, as a teacher, I want to know how people learn and how to become a more effective teacher. And so I decided to get a PhD, and I had the opportunity to do so. I got my PhD, and I fell in love with research. And during that time at the National Science Foundation, I was specifically working with people in the field of informal science learning, formal STEM learning, really. And it just reminded me of how important learning outside of school, those conversations I had with my dad, were for my own development and my own identity development. And so after I got my PhD, I decided that's what I wanted to spend my life studying, people learning science outside of school. I know in education, in STEM education, we think a lot about producing scientists or mathematicians or whatever, but even for those that don't end up, formally studying a STEM field, this is important information, and bringing it back to this idea of COVID-19, there's some basic facts or knowledge that's going to help you interpret the news that you're hearing. So, you don't have to be a scientist to have a need for understanding a little bit about how viruses work. And, and so this is the kind of information that's not just about becoming a scientist or a mathematician or studying that formally, but having enough literacy, what they call literacy, to interpret the news that you're hearing, to say, well, this is valuable, and no, that sounds like, misinformation. And then make decisions about your life, or maybe go vote a certain way, because it's a policy that's related to some kind of scientific concept.
Right.
So I see this as valuable for people like you and me who end up staying as professionals, but then also for people who just need to make everyday decisions, in their lives that are related to how much they understand science.
I think this might be a good place to circle back. So what resources would you offer to your mom or somebody like her in that tough situation of being a single mother with kids who doesn't necessarily speak English very well, and all of this information is not as accessible to her? What resources would you offer in talking about COVID-19, right? And all these very scary scientific issues.
The advantage that we have now that we didn't have then is that for many families, and even for many low-income families, access to the internet is almost ubiquitous, right? So most of us have access to the internet, or can go to a library, where we can get access to the internet. And the web has so many resources. So then the question is, how do we help parents decide where, with the thousands of places that the children can go to, where do they get, where do we send them for the right information? Yeah. And that's really ultimately what I hope my research ends up deciding. And it's really going to be partly of where do parents get their information. So like I was saying earlier, I might go to the NIH site to learn more about COVID-19, but my mom, knowing my mom, she probably would have been listening to Telemundo or Radio Martí. I don't know if you've heard of those.
Yeah,
but that's probably where my mom would have gotten her information. That or my aunt. My aunt would have been listening to Telemundo, and then she would have called my mom, right? And so it's like understanding where people get their news, or the majority of their news, and then putting the resources where it's like what you said. You are meeting them where they're at. You're not asking them to sift through 1,000, links, or you're not asking them to go through YouTube and try and have them identify the best resources, but go to where they're already going, leverage that infrastructure to share, hey, these are the best resources for you. That's not a full answer, but that's kind of like what I'm starting to formulate, and hopefully get some more concrete ideas as this research goes on.